This is Football at 4.
Football at 4, powered by the Inside the Birds podcast and brought to you by Bet365. Whatever the sport, whatever the moment, it's never ordinary. At Bet365, Geoff Mosher is host of the Inside the Birds podcast. He is set to join us here to take a look at the Eagles OTAs that open tomorrow, actually today, and they'll continue on for a couple of days this week. It's a lot happening with the Eagles, and of course, whenever they do something, it is news, Geoff Mosher, and they will be they're out there today. What is actually happening with the OTAs this week? What can the fans expect to get out of these OTAs?
Well, on today's OTA, where they all report, right? Hi, I'm Cooper DeJean. I just said, oh, nice to meet you. I'm Reed Blankenship. What's going on? No. Obviously, the whole team gets back and reconvenes, and they like training camp has a ramp-up process, and OTAs have always been a little similar, where you start to, you do one thing one day, a little more the next day, a little more the day after that. Unfortunately, media access to OTAs nowadays is so much different than it used to be, where you could, back in the day, OTAs was like, I'm going every day, I'm going to see who's running with what team. But now they only open up one day to media. And at this stage of our careers, we Andrew DeCecco is our reporter. We send him and rely on his intel and what we hear from our sources. So I don't get to observe it as much. None of us do as much as we used to.
Yeah, I know that there's a lot of questions about this team, and I guess OTA is kind of the first, place where we get some of these questions answered a little bit. One of the things I want to get your take on is seeing something Pro Football Focus. They're doing all their offseason projections and everything. Surprised at all by you to hear their offensive line ranked second in the NFL? I mean, we still look at this offensive line as one of the premier offensive lines in football. You got a new center, going to get a new right guard. Are you surprised by that? Or do you still say, no, of course this is still one of the best units in football?
It's funny. I'm a religious listener to your show, especially in the offseason when I have more time, and I love your show. And I heard you tease this segment to me, and I did not look at the PFF rankings. I still haven't seen them, and I was trying to think, where did I think PFF had them ranked? And I felt like it was going to be top three, only because for whatever reason, since the inception of PFF, they have always had a love affair with the Eagles offensive line, going back to, I think Evan Mathis was like their 3-time offensive lineman or highest rated offensive lineman of the year. He was like the poster boy for PFF for quite a while there. So it didn't surprise me that you say that they're number 2. I did not look. I'd be curious to see who they had number 1. I was in my head, I'm like, well, they still have 3 Pro Bowlers, and they still have guys who grade out very highly on PFF, and that's, Lane Johnson, that's Jordan Mailata, and Lane Dickerson. And we know in the NFL, a lot of teams struggle to just find 1 or 2 really good offensive linemen. So it doesn't surprise me that even with the question marks that the Eagles have, that based on their grading system, PFF would still see the Eagles as a elite offensive line. I'll take a stab and say Chiefs number 1, because, their left guard, center, right guard combo or trio is pretty damn good.
Chiefs are number 8, actually.
What? I guess because of the tackle situation. All right.
Yep. It says, yeah, you're right about that. It says probably the best interior line in the NFL, but inconsistencies at tackles for the Chiefs. They are at number 8.
I'm just trying to think about who would have as much equal individual talent.
Yeah, when I saw who was number 1, I was not overly surprised. Like, what are they talking about? I think this is legit.
Baltimore?
Baltimore is. I don't think even Baltimore was in the top. Nope, they were not in the top 8.
Wow. Dallas.
No Dallas either. No, Dallas is starting to get old, and they had a lot of problems up front. They drafted 2 offensive linemen. Detroit is number 1 with Decker, Glasnow, Ragnow, Zeitler, and Penei Sewell. So, yes, they are now the best.
That goes back to the conversation we had. I'm sorry to interrupt you. That goes back to the conversation that you and I had, I think, last Wednesday, right, where I feel like people are sleeping on the Lions, even though that people recognize that they're a very good team. I think they should be the favorites in the entire NFC.
That's interesting you say that. I think Adam was on Friday, says he thinks he likes Green Bay to win that division.
Yeah, Adam and I talked about in the pod too. I think the Lions could use a little bit more in the pass rush, but they've been able to manufacture. Obviously Aiden Hutchinson has developed for them. They could really use a secondary guy, but they're so strong in offensive line. Goff has really benefited from them. He's really come back into his own. Their receivers are very legit with Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Jamison Williams is getting better. And yeah, they lost Josh Reynolds, but Sam Laporta is now the guy. I mean, he had such a good rookie year on third down. He could be your safety valve guy. They're good at linebacker. They added to corner. They drafted Terrion Arnold. I think they traded for the guy from Tampa Bay. So, I mean, they're pretty good. Obviously.
I don't know.
They're really good, I think.
I agree. I think like we were saying this before, we were laughing, we're living in a world right now where in most power rankings, Detroit's in the top 5. I said, look, what NFL world is the Detroit Lions being in the top 5 legitimate, right? I mean, when was the last time you could say, like last year they were kind of like the up-and-coming team, but I think now it's fair to say that they are a legitimate contender. But that division, you got them and Green Bay. That's going to be interesting there. You got Philly and Dallas in the East. I guess the South, I would say Tampa and Atlanta are the 2 teams that are going to battle there. And San Francisco and I guess the Rams in the West.
Yeah, I am higher on the Rams than most people. I think the Rams are a really good team. And I think they've drafted well the last 2 years. And I know they lost Aaron Donald. That's hard to replace. I wouldn't be surprised if in like November, if they're like, 3 or 4 games above 5, they're looking like a team that can win that division and do well in the playoffs. If Aaron Donald says, you know what, I'm going to pull myself a Ndamukong Suh and Linval Joseph and come back and play the last 7 or 8 games of the season in the playoffs. We'll see what happens there. But I just think the Rams are really solid. Very, very good team.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because they had so many injuries the last couple of years. And last year I think people forget they made the playoffs last year when they got healthy. But now they lost Donald. We'll see what ends up there. But their offense should be, I think if they're healthy, their offense is really good. And you're taking a look at, this whole NFC. And it feels weird that so many people looked at this Eagles team and the way they kind of fell apart last year. But everybody looked at them. Pro Football Focus says, look, they had an A offensive or off season here. Doesn't it feel that everybody is almost taking that late slide and giving them a pass for that?
For sort of like there's no way that can happen again.
Right. Like they're taking more that like a lot of the power rankings have Philadelphia top 5. It feels like people look at them as still, more of a Super Bowl or bust type of team than what we saw at the end of last year. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that has to do with sort of the flukish slide that they had. I mean, it was real. There was a reason for it, but I mean, nobody saw that coming. And then the offseason in which they bring in Saquon Barkley, C.J. Gardner-Johnson, Vic Fangio, they generally got good feedback from their draft and took care of the secondary there. So I do think that people are giving them a little bit of a pass there. I think that's fair. It's funny because on the podcast that we had this morning, we just started off talking about this like sort of predictable cycle of the offseason. When the Eagles have a bad season or a bad finish like last year, there's this predictable cycle, right, where the fans just hate the team. They can't stand. They think they're going to be no good for a long time. And then what happens is a little time goes by. Then you have free agency and you sign some big names that people recognize, right? And then you have the draft, and generally fans like the draft. They don't know if it's going to work out, but it's names that you're hoping for. The team usually makes a sensible move. I know a couple of years ago when they bypassed Justin Jefferson, people didn't like that. But generally, people are happy with a draft, and they're feeling good. And then all of a sudden, like 3 months later, it's like I was listening to some shows last week, and I heard people calling in and texting your show and saying, oh, this is a 13, 14-win team. And I'm like, what happened to, this is the worst team ever in February when they're getting, bounced, or January bounced by 20-some-odd points to the Buccaneers. But it happens every single year. It's funny because you're right. We're going through the schedule, and a lot of people, just kind of looking at how it sets up. It's like that 11. It feels like everybody's in that 11 to 12 win range with like a high point of 13, and I guess like the low point maybe being 10. But after what we saw last year, to say that this could be a team that wins 10, 11, 12 games, it's pretty surprising when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, like, there's obviously talent on this team, and the things that made them not good last year, especially on defense, you would like to think that they've rectified with some of their offseason moves, both in the coaching staff and in personnel. And same thing offensively, you'd like with Kellen Moore. But I mean, I also will tell you, like, nobody ever anticipates the player who's not going to play well that had played well. For example, nobody went into last year, right, thinking James Bradbury was going to fall off the face of the earth. Nobody went into last year thinking the offense would not figure out how to pick up a blitz. Nobody went into last year thinking that the defensive line, by the end of the year, Josh Sweat was not going to be able to sack a quarterback. So everybody gets excited about who's coming in and all the upgrades, but people don't take into account that every year there's going to be somebody in 2024 who does not play well that you're expecting to play well. It could be Darius Slay getting older. It could be somebody else. I'm just saying that is the nature of the sport, and it's the one thing that I think people have a blind spot to as they try to evaluate the team on a year-to-year basis. That plus the fact that every NFL team spends its offseason trying to get better, and sometimes people look at the schedule and they're like, yeah, we're going to beat that team. They're this, they're that. Washington thinks this team. No, well, those teams also tried to get better too.
Yeah, I know, and I like the article that Andrew wrote over at InsideTheBirds.com, which was kind of finding that breakout guy of who's the guy that you're keeping an eye on to be someone that maybe we aren't talking about enough.
Well, you know, I'm really fascinated. Maybe we are talking about him, but Jordan Davis to me is, I would say, even the tandem, the sort of Jordan Davis and Nakobe Dean up front tandem. Like, we talked about that a lot last year. And I remember telling you, in order for Nakobe Dean to have a really successful season, Jordan Davis has to have a successful season because Jordan Davis has to keep bodies off of Nakobe Dean. Now, I don't attribute Nakobe Dean's injury to Jordan Davis not playing well because Nakobe Dean got hurt so early in the season, and that's actually when Jordan Davis was playing well. But the bottom line is, for this defense, especially with Nick Fangio here, Davis has to keep the weight off. Apparently, I've seen some pictures. He looks really good, and he's lost the weight, and you know, we'll see if he can keep it off and be more than just a flash player that he was for the first half of last year. And obviously, Nakobe Dean I'm sure they want him to start and seize that role and be the guy that they feel like they got a steal out of in the third round. But he's got to stay healthy and he's got to be productive, or else it's just going to be another carousel at linebacker for them.
Well, and we all know, you know, it's funny. We had Colin Thompson on last week on Thursday's show. I don't know if you heard that at all, but he was going on, and he played against Devin White, and he thinks, you know, he's heard a lot of negative stuff about White, and he really thinks that is something or somebody that people are not kind of taking accounting for. And then I was listening to a podcast the other day, Moving the Sticks with Daniel Jeremiah and Bucky Brooks, and Brooks said the same thing. He said he thinks Devin White is the most underrated signing of the offseason.
Yeah, I did hear that. And listen, I sort of raised my hand as saying guilty as far as I was in the camp of this is the kind of guy that everybody gets excited about because at one point he was the man, top 5 pick, all pro. But I am the guy saying, remember, he was benched. Remember, he's known for sort of being reckless out there. Now he's going to be asked to play in a very disciplined defense. But I should also be the first to say then that, you know, if he can make some of the adjustments that, you know, made him one time a very good player in this league, then the Eagles got to steal. It's just that I think we've seen so many times, whether it's a Takeo Spikes or an Ernie Sims or I mean, there are other players in the secondary who've come to the Eagles with this label. Kevin Byard last year, right, with this label of being, oh man, this guy was once a really good player, and all he's got to do is be in the right environment and get back to this. And we've almost never seen it. I mean, we've seen that at Chris Long and at Patrick Robinson in 2017, but I feel like we've seen far more examples of guys who didn't have the rebound you were hoping for as opposed to who did.
Yeah, I know that, one thing, I think a lot of fans know the guy's name and were excited about him. Some people were like, hey, he hasn't played as well. We'll see. Nobody knows what he's going to end up doing here. But the fact that the Eagles kind of targeted to bring him in, that's the one thing is they have not ever kind of gone that direction. So that's what kind of makes you intrigued a little bit more is to see, all right, what do they see from him and how do they think they can get more out of him? Because, Moshe, everybody always thinks they can get more than the previous regime did, right?
Right. And that's why I've kind of brought up those names from the past where people got excited about guys who played well elsewhere, had a little lull and thought, we can be the team. The Eagles will be the team that resurrects that. But, sometimes a lot of times it hasn't happened.
Yeah. One thing we looked at, too, last week was the quarterbacks that the Eagles will face this year. I don't know about you. You got Joe Burrow, I would imagine him, Lamar Jackson, Love, Kirk Cousins. It's not – they have like a few of the top-end guys, but not a whole heck of a lot. We were navigating through that when you're taking a look at your schedule, the amount of like high top-tier quarterbacks that you face. I mean, Dak Prescott is probably one of the better guys they will face in the course of the season. So that's another manageable reason, I think, for people who like 11 to 12 wins.
Yeah, and that's fair. But, in this league, if you're just not sound defensively like the Eagles were last year, you can get beat by that guy who's a number 9 quarterback. He's not top 5. He's more like 9 or 10, whether that's a Dak or a Matthew Stafford, right? Or I'm trying to think who else is on the schedule. I mean, I have no idea where Jordan Love's going to be by the end of the year. He could be top 5, but right now he falls in that range along with Kirk Cousins. But any of those guys I just mentioned there on their best days are capable of playing like number 1 quarterback.
They have a lot of those guys.
Jordan Love hasn't won a lot, but yeah, there's a lot of those guys on the schedule. There's not a lot of from 2 years ago when it was just, remember when they had to like play the Giants and it was Jake Fromm leaving, who was it? I forget. I can't even remember, but it was just the most awful quarterbacking you've ever seen in your life. I mean, they kind of got by for a long stretch on some really mediocre to bad quarterbacks, which is fine. I mean, that's going to happen. I'm not taking anything away from them, but I don't see this year a stretch where you're like, oh, you got 4 games in a row against guys who can barely throw the ball.
Right. Yeah. We 2 years ago, right? That was the whole. Hey, they haven't beaten anybody, they haven't played anybody, and you're like, well, there's nobody really on your schedule to play. I mean, the whole league was that was a year where a lot of quarterbacks were getting hurt, and of course, who cared? They ended up going to the Super Bowl. So for whatever that's worth, they get to the Super Bowl last year. They come back 10-1. We know the story. We'll see how they continue. It all starts today. OTAs, and then rest of the week, they're off tomorrow, Wednesday, Thursday. They'll have some media availability. We'll talk more about that right here on Football at 4. Geoff Mosher. Adam's here tomorrow. Mosher's back on Wednesday. Andrew on Thursday. Adam on Friday. And don't forget, check out the latest edition of the Inside the Birds podcast on all podcasting platforms, and check out their YouTube channel. Just search Inside the Birds. Geoff Mosher, my friend. Take care, bud.
All right, Mark, take care. Talk to you Wednesday.
There you go. Geoff Mosher here on the Sports Bash Live for Football at 4, as we do each and every day, 4 o'clock. We'll do a little bit more Eagles this week. They are back at OTAs.